Please join us in welcoming to the stage Geoffrey von Maltzahn, co-founder and chief innovation officer of Indigo Agriculture.
Here comes the sun, doo-doo-doo. Here comes the sun, and I say it's alright.
Excellent. First of all, I love entrepreneurial stories, so that was spectacular. It's a pleasure to be here. In other rooms, when people think about moonshots, they don't often think about the one technology upon which all of our lives depend every single day, and that's, simplistically growing on fields around the world, and that's agriculture. And agriculture needs a ton of moonshots. Our moonshot at Indigo is roughly to try to make our food system much better for all of our health, much more profitable for growers and their local communities, and more sustainable for the planet around us. So that means we've got a lot of work to do, and we're still at the very beginning. And we've got a phrase in Indigo that there aren't enough years in the day for what we're trying to do. And when you behave that way and try to put years into days, when a whole year goes by, it's kind of amazing what happens. So I wanted to walk you through some of the questions that have driven our evolution at Indigo and the growth over the past few years, and which are informing the road ahead of us. The start of the company, the foundation of what we do is based on a pretty simple question, which is that maybe over thousands of years of plant breeding and 100+ years of modern plant genetics, we had overlooked a fundamental aspect of what it means to be a plant. And specifically, if you were a plant, what that would mean is that you would have microbes living inside of every one of your tissues. Oh, let me see if that goes back. So why is that profound? Well, if you were a microbe and you got to pick some place to live on this slide, where would you want to live? So you could live on a grain of sand, and there are microbes that do that. So if you Google microbe grain of sand, scanning electron microscope, you see microbes clinging to a grain of sand. But that sucks. But if you could live inside of a plant, that's like Club Med. Like it's wet, and you're surrounded by sugar and nutrients, and you're protected from the environment. And perhaps the only downside is that if that plant dies, you've probably met your maker as well. And that's where it gets profound. So for hundreds of millions of years, every plant in the world has had microbes inside of it, deeply motivated with their own life depending on the life and health of the plant that they live inside of. So that has led these microbes, we believed, to be motivated to flip every single light switch inside of a plant's biology that they could to improve their health and survival under every single stress that's important to our food system. So the start of the company was that just maybe every crop in every geography on every farm is facing a set of stresses that Mother Nature's already invented solutions for in these rare and special microbes that live inside of plants. So we realized early in our science that every single plant in a field has a unique microbiome inside of it. That's a community of microbes living inside of its tissues. So that's kind of like us. Each of us has a unique repertoire of microbes that lives inside of us. So what that means when you zoom out to the planet is that a quadrillion seeds are planted every year in agriculture, and every one of those is a little microbiome experiment. Every one of those seeds is going to get its own unique fingerprint of microbes that are going to affect perhaps the health of those plants in different ways. So we started going to places like this. So if you're a farmer, this is awful. You probably won't even harvest this part of your field. But if you're a scientist who's interested in the biology of microbiomes, this is spectacular. So basically, twin soy plants were planted in this field. The environment and stress that they were exposed to was reasonably uniform, but something made all the difference in these few plants that survived. So what we do is we go to those plants and we sample them and we surface sterilize them, and it allows us to be able to isolate the special microbes that live inside of these plants' tissues. We've now done this on every single continent except Antarctica, and every time I say some version of that, I think we should just get somebody on a plane and go to Antarctica so that we've done every continent. And what it's given us is a deeper view into the tree of life that lives inside of $1 trillion of crops around the world. So this is what that network of microbes look like. Every dot on here is a species, just like we as humans are species. We've collected 50,000 plus microbes isolated from plant samples that would be arranged within those dots. And what we found is that those microbes isolated from these extraordinary survivor plants in agricultural fields, a subset of them, when they're coated onto agricultural seeds and planted, dramatically improve the stress tolerance of those seeds. So what you're seeing here is cotton in the upper left and other crops where a commercial variety of seeds that is the sort of best of plant genetics that's available in the market today is planted the way it normally would, or it's planted with the benefit of one or more microbes that we've discovered in our process. And that's what you see on the right side here, and on the right side here, on the right side here, et cetera. It's pretty cool, like the little biology of these life forms that come from Mother Nature's lab and thousands of years of R&D that we're just tapping into is dramatically increasing the physiology and stress resilience of these crops. It has led to yield improvements between 6 and double-digit percentage points, which, for contrast, across the 5 largest crops in the world, is 5 to 10x larger than the annual rate of yield improvement of these crops with the status quo. That's not quite apples to apples. It's actually more like apples to apple cart in that that's everything. So that 1% or 1.5% is the sum of all innovation flowing into agriculture from GMOs, chemistries, breeding equipment, and farmer ingenuity. And this one little island of what Mother Nature has invented in the plant microbiome is sort of jumping us forward in time. So as you might expect, that's led us to seek to translate these discoveries quickly into a commercial business. And the first year we did that was in 2017, and we were on just under 300,000 acres in the United States. A year after, we had just done just better than doubling that. And by the first part of this year, we had reached 2.1 million acres with microbiome-coated seeds in the United States, and in Brazil, Argentina, Australia, and then a joint venture in Indigo that isn't highlighted on this slide. So that's been expanding quite rapidly. And the more we reflected on the way we were discovering these microbes and the fact that 99% of that discovery was happening in the field. So there's billions of acres of agricultural land. Everyone has millions of pounds of soil. Every pound of soil has billions of living microbes in them. By skipping all of that and jumping to these crops that have survived an extraordinary stress, the vast majority of our lab is the field itself. It led us to wonder maybe the best lab at every step of what we do should be the field itself. And that might sound straightforward, but it's actually not the way the industry usually does things. So lots of stuff are done in labs, and we do that too. And then when things go to the field, they often go to an experimental approach that's called a small plot field trial. So it looks roughly something like this. Where you take a highly uniform field, looks more like a golf course than a farm, and you randomize your experiment and your controls. And this experimental paradigm has been around for hundreds of years. And hundreds of years ago, this was important so that you could, with a pencil and paper, determine whether or not your experiment worked. Well, the challenge with doing something like this is that that doesn't look anything like a real-world field. Real-world fields are highly heterogeneous and stresses vary dramatically across the width or length of that field. And when the context changes, the likelihood the experiment that you conducted in a controlled condition is going to translate to success in that field becomes low. So this is what real-world fields look like. And we realized that the disadvantage of them being highly variable might in fact be a massive advantage if we could understand that variability. Because then we could run experiments where across a highly variable environment, which is the real world, you could understand whether your treatment was working or not. So we started about a year and a half ago instrumenting fields of some of the largest and most sophisticated growers in the US to really understand like real world conditions and be able to run more sophisticated experiments in that context. So that took us from, in the first couple years of what we'd done, sort of being roughly at 2,000 or so acres of total field experimentation that we'd run, In June of last year, we announced what we think about as the world's largest agricultural lab, based on taking 60,000 acres and embedding sensors throughout the field so that we understand moisture throughout the day, temperature throughout the day, sample the nutrients of the soil, and many other things. And that has dramatically expanded our ability to be able to understand what's going on in fields. This is like wearing sensors all over your body in terms of being able to sort of monitor daily variations and minute-by-minute variations. And each one of these fields now produces for us about 1 trillion total data points, sort of telling us about the heartbeat or the biology taking place inside those areas. So through this, we've now substantially increased the number of microbes that we're testing, but also a whole bunch of other technologies. It turns out that a real-world field where you understand what's going on is also a better environment to test perhaps every other individual technology that could be benefiting growers. And one of those collaborations led us to a question that we started to ask a couple of years ago, which was that maybe we could take the kind of data that's pouring off of these fields and zoom out to the scale of the planet and try to build a living map of the entire world's food supply. I.e., maybe the amount of ground truth data that we were generating across Indigo's activity could be connected to what you could observe from outer space and other remote sensors to learn something about the entirety of our food system altogether. So that collaboration actually started with a joke. At the beginning of the company, when it became evident that growers wanted to see it to believe it and see it from the side of a field, I had joked that if we were right about the biology of the plant microbiome, we should be able to see it from the side of the field and from outer space. So we started testing that about 2 years ago. And in fact, you can see the effect of the plant microbiome from outer space, which I think is incredibly cool. In fact, now our commercial teams use that when they're talking to growers to say, look, if you want to outdo your neighbors, even from outer space, you should be working with Indigo. And this is a sample of that in one of the first seasons we were doing this. It's about 25,000 acres. The Indigo fields, the worst case scenario is about the midpoint of what you would achieve in the absence of Indigo's microbiome solution. Those insights and the data from all these sensors and the ability to be able to fuse data coming from satellites that watch the world every single day have allowed us to start to build a living map of the whole world's food supply. So everybody, this room uses Google Maps with a level of frequency that's almost become second nature to figure out, is there a Starbucks opening up in Boston tomorrow? Or where's my hotel going to be in LA? But for examples of rooftop agriculture, we don't have a lot of information about downtown Boston or LA and what we're building. But if you were to go to outside of Dodge, Nebraska on Google Maps, the world's most important corn harvest wouldn't have a lot of information accessible to you. What we obsess about is monitoring those areas, i.e. understanding and predicting what's taking place on every field that's participating in our world's food system. And we've now been beating USDA estimates of the US and other geographies' yield estimates for a few years running. So that perspective, and hopefully you get the picture, what people often ascribe to be kind of an apple falling on Newton's head and all companies are just one idea, one moment in time, is total nonsense. Like, great journeys and great adventures are an accumulation of kind of constant inquiry and perseverance along the way. And the perspective we started to gain through the fields that we were working with and putting sensors into, and from observing the food system at scale from outer space, led us to realize that we've got this huge commodity system that actually erases a remarkable amount of individual variability in grower decisions, in quality that gets produced on different farms, and it all basically gets piled together like gravel and then put onto trains and other portions of our commodity transportation network. We started to ask, why do we even have a commodity system anymore? And this is so ingrained in sort of our assumption set around the largest portions of the world food system that this question in particular made us just look outright idiotic in the ag community for a short period of time, or maybe still. But if you question the fundamental logic of something, it's worth starting with first principles or rewinding the clock and saying, all right, what were the conditions that led to the commodity system and have those changed? Well, that is the breakthrough technology that enabled our modern commodity system. It's the steam engine, not the black and white camera. 100 plus years ago, modernized transportation or the ability to mechanize locomotion allowed us to, as a society, move to urban areas, produce food in rural areas, and then pile that food together and transport it over long distances. And to do that, you basically had to qualify a minimal viable definition of corn, of wheat, of rice, etc. Well, gosh, hopefully with this playing in the background, you realize things have changed a lot since those days. So it's at least technologically worth us taking a step back and asking whether we still need a commodity system. And if you think about it from an individual perspective, since we are what we eat, why would we want to be eating commodities? Why would we want the world's largest portions of the food system to just set a minimal bar of environmental sustainability, of pesticide residue, of nutritional quality, to standardize what flows into our diet? I mean, literally, we are made up atom by atom of atoms that enter our body through the foods that we eat, which means that they're gathered from the plants that live on farms around the world, from the atmosphere around them and from the soil. And to have this sort of big minimum definition of quality sitting between the world's food system and us would strike one as an undesirable situation. So our vision became, how do we build a scalable system whereby the individual criteria that a grower uses in their decision making and the relationship of decisions on farms to the environment around them, the individual quality attributes of what they produce, can flow into the world's food system without being mixed with all of their neighbors' production. So every field producing effectively a specialty or an individual product. So to do that, last June we launched what we call Indigo Marketplace. This is basically a NASDAQ for grain. Growers today, somewhat remarkably, make the most important economic decision they make in a year by picking up the phone and calling a few people and agreeing on a price to sell their grain. It feels like that should have gone away 20 years ago, but that's the way it happens today. It's a highly relationship-based thing. But to try to draw you into a grower situation, if you imagine there was no NASDAQ and you had 20 shares of Google that you wanted to sell, and you were stuck in a position where you had to call a few people to see if they wanted to buy your shares of Google and agree upon price, it's unlikely that you're going to reach a fair price every time. And if your friends that you're calling, A, aren't your friends, and B, are a million times more powerful than you, then all of that unfairness is going to be wielded to your disadvantage. So instead, if you have a digital marketplace, one can interact with the entire market and a broader array of participants, and you can digitally make quite complex calculations as to what your most advantaged potential transaction is. More fundamentally, once something enters the digital world, the incremental cost to move it away from a commodity is almost zero. Then all of a sudden, if a grower uses no synthetic fertilizer, or if they use no synthetic chemistry, or if they're net carbon negative and are sequestering carbon on their farm, they can enter those criteria and interact with buyers that are seeking to access food from that food system. So the funny thing about marketplaces is that you're trying to get two parties together and you are literally useless to both parties until they're both there. So if you have all growers involved, you're of zero value to those growers until you have buyers involved. If you have all buyers involved, same thing. So you have to have this delicate dance of getting everybody to the party at the same time before it's of any benefit to any of the participants. So this is what that last year has looked like in terms of participants and markers in marketplace between buyers in blue and growers in red. This is what the curve of transactions, or rather of bids that have flown through marketplace over just about the past year and a half. So we started this in June. It wasn't an idea prior to that. It was a like massive detailed plan that we were going to run against, but it was completely hypothetical. 4 months later, we had $2 billion of bids that had gone through Marketplace, and that seemed like a gigantic achievement. 4 months after that, it was close to about $10 billion in bids. 4 months later, it was at 50, and 4 months after that, we're over $200 billion in bids. So this isn't done. The food system is gigantic. This isn't even a definition of success in the United States. But where it's going is inevitable. Like this, to us, is the way that grain is going to transact. And this is that same sequence that I showed you, but with circles flashing of transactions taking place. So these are the first digital transactions taking place in Indigo Marketplace, sort of accruing over time. This to me is so awesome. It's maybe less exhilarating to you. But this is our food system going into the digital world. And when it does that, it's not going to come back. And that means that the incremental cost associated with being able to allow consumer votes for the agriculture that they want can be specified and can flow all the way back to the behaviors and practices of growers around the world. So thus far, we've booked about 360 million bushels through Marketplace. I figure this isn't a crowd that thinks about bushels on a daily basis, so I'd define that. Bushel is about 60 pounds, depending on the crop. And so that means we have booked approximately 21 billion pounds of grain through Marketplace. There's something that was an idea a year and a half ago. That may not be the most intuitive thing either, so I figured I'd give it another try. That is roughly 1.5 million elephants. So remarkably, that's about 3 times more than the number of elephants than there are in the world. So if we'd built Marketplace to exchange elephants, we would be done and we would be transacting elephants again and again. So hopefully that brings bushels to life. So back to food. Since the enabling technology for the commodity system was in part a transportation revolution, it occurred to us that maybe a decommoditized system will benefit or require innovations in transportation as well. And specifically, if you're producing something of higher quality or of higher environmental sustainability, you can't mix it with all of your neighbor's grain and still get paid for that. But favorably, all grain travels by truck at least once. And oftentimes that's trucks that the farmer owns or trucks that their neighbors help them to be able to access. But most frequently, those are driving to the elevator to be able to mix it with all of their neighbor's grain. If you could digitally connect with those trucks such that a producer that has an attribute of quality that somebody else is willing to pay for is able to interact with a transportation system that can take that grain exactly to that buyer, then you have the sort of minimal components for a fully decommoditized system. So in September of last year, we launched what we call Indigo Transport, and we didn't announce it until February of this year, but we started accruing relationships with growers and trucks and signing them up into this network. Since launching this, we've added about 7,000 trucks into the Indigo Transport system. And you can see this sort of roughly overlays with the area of activities in Marketplace. These are the routes that those trucks have run just since something that was still an idea in September of last year has been brought into existence. We've booked 16 million bushels through Indigo Transport. So again, bushel is roughly, does anybody remember, 60 pounds depending on the crop. So that is about 1 billion pounds of grain, which again, big number, about 3 pounds for every person living in the United States. Or alternatively, you could think of that as over 290,000 hippos. So that's also more than the number of hippos that live on the planet. So if we had built transport starting in September of last year to move hippos around, we would have moved every single one of them. And we'd be trying to figure out reasons why they should be moved twice. So this is what we're building. You're going to see this overlaid in the United States. So this is our treated seed, Indigo Research Partners relationships, Indigo Marketplace, Indigo Transport. And we've expanded the first of those, our microbiome innovations, to Argentina, Brazil, India, Australia, and we've now opened up operations in Europe. You can see where this story's going. So, like, this system, in various ways, is applicable to every country and most, if not every, crop, in terms of better connecting consumers in society and what we would want our food system to look like with the decisions, practices, technologies, and the outputs of farms around the world. So, if you imagine we're done asking questions, then that would be missing a big point of what's behind this. What's fun about what we're doing is it always feels like we're at the very beginning. That's also exhausting, but it's mostly fun. And one of the questions that we've most recently been spending a lot of time thinking about is, what if agriculture, which is frequently described as a big part of the problem with respect to environmental sustainability and our climate, has an opportunity to be among, if not the most powerful solution for counteracting climate change? So why would that be? Well, if you think about a field of corn, imagine yourself driving past it. Literally everything green came from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So on a pound-for-pound basis, a pound of corn stalk, corn leaves, plants in fields, roughly requires a pound of CO2 to be pulled out of the atmosphere in order to build that crop. Well, the way we farm today, with tilling widely utilized, with very few cover crops planted, with little diversity in our food system, releases most of that CO2 back in the atmosphere. But there are practices that people call regenerative agricultural practices that in fact allow that carbon dioxide to be sequestered and to accumulate in the soil of the farm, potentially providing the most economically effective, the most scalable, and most attractive means by which we can pull down carbon that's accumulated in the atmosphere and bring it into soils, thereby providing a whole bunch of benefits to those farms in the process. So this summer we announced an initiative called the Terra initiative, which is a global effort that seeks to, in the spirit of moonshots, draw down 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sequester it into the soils that reside on farms around the world. And I'd welcome any discussions about that, and you can Google Terra and Indigo and find out more. So in the theme of moonshots, traveling to the moon is a big deal. Securing the future of our world's food supply would be really good too. So anytime you're talking about moonshots to people, have them look both up and down for opportunities to try to positively impact the world. Thank you all for having me.